I set up an international consortium based in London. I can't tell you all the details yet, but we're trying to put together something like an alternative vision of the future, say an alternative to that kind of apocalyptic narrative that's being put forward, at least implicitly, by organizations like the WEF, and that's the virginal planet, rapacious tyrant, all-devouring consumer religion. And it's more like something like, well, we want to ask people 6 key questions. Okay, so how do we get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost as rapidly as possible to the largest number of people around the world? That's one question. And so there's a presumption in the question, and here's one of the presumptions. You don't get to save the planet by making energy prices so expensive that no one poor can afford them. That's off the table. So if you want to develop alternative energy sources, no problem, because, hey, man, the more energy sources we have, the better. But you don't get to impose your utopian vision in the service of your narcissism on the poor. We're going to try to make the poor rich. Can I try to alleviate absolute poverty? Pro-human view. On environmental stewardship front, that's the next question. What are the major problems that are confronting us? How do we take a sophisticated multidimensional view of that? How do we prioritize our attempts to establish our states and our international relationships properly so that we prioritize human well-being, in harmony with nature to the degree that's possible, but human-focused and not predicated on the idea that there are too many goddamn mouths on the planet to feed and that you're evil if you just think about having children. So then on the governance front, this is where it gets kind of more left-wing, I would say, is none of the people involved in this consortium so far are very thrilled with global corporate fascist government media and corporation collusion. And we're seeing this at the high end. It's like a Tower of Babel, is that the powerful players in the world are increasingly collaborating to impose a top-down vision of the future on everyone. And that's a future that's predicated on a zero-growth model. And the idea that, well, we'd need 5 planets really to support everyone at the current standard of living that obtains in the West. So the best pathway forward is to deny loans by the World Bank to developing countries so they can't develop, energy sources, which all that'll mean is they're going to burn wood and coal, obviously. So that's the third question is, how do we arrange systems of governance to stop the march of something like pathological gigantism? This is why I like people like Russell Brand and also you to some degree politically, because you guys are very, what would you say, sensitive to the danger of that kind of corrupt collusion, that regulatory capture that occurs when corporate entities and media entities and governmental entities are all in bed together, like the FDA and the CDC and so forth and so on without end. So that's the third question. The fourth question is, what do we put forward as a vision on the family policy front to facilitate the, what would you call it, the encouragement and the maintenance of long-term monogamous couples who are child-centered, and to make increasing the birth rate part of that policy, to put policies in place that would support long-term stable monogamous families, 2-parent families, and child-centered. Because in the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. That's a responsible way of thinking about it. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what that means. And, it's tricky because, I think the ideal has to be long-term committed monogamous heterosexual relationships. And I had a big conversation about this with Dave Rubin. Rubin's gay and he's married, and him and his partner now have 2 infants, and we talked through how that was. It was a very hard thing for them to arrange, obviously. Why? Well, they're both male. So that poses a severe problem on the reproductive front, right? And so they managed that, and they have 2 infants, but it's very complex, and it's obviously not a solution to the problem of relationship and reproduction that's duplicatable across large numbers of people. It just takes too many resources. Now, I do think we have to have an ideal at the center of every concept. But the ideal can't be too rigid, because people aren't perfect. in my own family, there's lots of people who are divorced. Lots of people, in lots of people's families, there are people who are gay. You know, there are lots of people in unhappy marriages. Nobody attains the ideal. So the ideal has to be surrounded by a fringe of tolerance, but that doesn't mean you sacrifice the ideal. And the ideal has to be, well, we know there's a literature on fatherlessness. You know, it's a bloody catastrophe, fatherlessness, for obvious reasons. You know, human children are complicated. You think you can, maybe if you struggle madly as a single parent, you could do a decent job, and lots of single parents do, but you're asking a lot, you know, for a woman to work 50 hours a week and then spend another 40 hours with her kids, and to do both of those optimally with no help. You know, and we know perfectly well that when women get divorced, especially if they have kids, they tend to fall down the economic hierarchy. So it's very difficult. So that's another one of the policies. Then another question. We're trying to make these into questions rather than, you know, we have the answer. The other question is, well, it's pretty clear that we have to live inside a story. And one story is power rules everything. But that's not a very good story. It's a very pathological story. It's more like a confession, too, if that's the story you insist upon. It's like, so you think power governs everything, do you? Okay, I know what you're like. So that's what you truly believe. See, I believe the spirit of voluntary play governs everything, not the spirit of power. It's like voluntary association. That's what we're doing in this conversation. You know, we're playing towards an end, and we're doing it voluntarily, and we're taking everybody along for the ride. No one's forced to do it. So that's the other thing. No compulsion here. It's got to be invitational. And so we're trying to work out what the story has to be. And on that front, I just finished a seminar in Miami, and the first 8 parts of it were released on the Daily Wire 3 months ago, Exodus seminar. We walked through the story of Exodus. Exodus means ex-hodos, means the way forward. So it's the archetypal narrative of progression from tyranny and chaos into the future. That's what the story is. And we did half of it, released it on the Daily Wire, 8 episodes, 2 hours long. And we just recorded the last 8 sessions 2 weeks ago, and that was an absolute blast. I had really stellar people participating. Man, I learned so much. It's